Thanks, Roger. Lovely to have that introduction. Lovely to be here as part of TASA Thursday and add my acknowledgement of country from Ghana land down in Adelaide. Today is just a result of thinking with excitement about social class and emotion in Australia and aiming to connect some of the great minds in Australian sociology around that topic. So I hope you'll find it interesting. We've got three really excellent presenters, Stephen, Belinda and Roger at a last minute stepping in to replace Cherie. So thanks very much, Roger, for your flexibility and willingness to come on board as of 2 days ago. So I won't take up any verbal space here because I, as much as all of you, wish to hear from the speakers directly. But what I would like to do is just read a brief bio for each speaker, outline that they'll speak for about 12 to 15 minutes each, and then there'll be time for questions at the end. So if you could just hold the questions after the individual speakers to make sure that everyone gets enough time. And I think hopefully we'll see some folding and interplay between the ideas in the different presentations. So Roger Patulny is a professor of sociology at Hong Kong Baptist University. His research interests include sociological studies of loneliness, social isolation, the sociology of emotions, and emotion management. The present study that he'll be talking about today focuses on interpersonal emotional labour. So, for example, the paid work we do supporting, cheering, or soothing others. And it uses data from the 2022 and 2023 Australian Social Attitude Survey to assess the degree to which Australian men and women perform this in the workplace. So I'll pass over to Roger and I'll mute myself. And then Roger, I'll just give you a bit of a wave at 15 minutes as needed.
Okay, thank you very much, Kristen. That was great. It's great to be here. I'm very sorry Cherie wasn't able to be here. She's not well. But thanks very much for the invite. It's good to be here. Let me just share my screen and bring up my slides, and then we'll be all ready to go. So I'm going to go straight to back to the top of my slide presentation. Sorry about that. Here we go. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. Today, I'm going to talk about interpersonal emotional labour and gender in Australia, talking about results from a national survey, which is the Australian Social Attitude Survey. I've been interested in the subject of emotions and emotional labour for well over a decade now. And written a couple of, we've been involved in publishing a couple of edited collections and special editions on related topics. And for a long time, I've been interested in doing survey research to try and find out more about emotional labour in the Australian context and in the context of gender in particular. Emotional labour is a well-recognised form of work. It's the work that people do for money to manage their own and others' emotions in line with workplace expectations. Emotional labour is linked to an array of negative outcomes. There are studies around, for example, linking it to poor health and stress-related outcomes. And prior work has shown that it's a highly gendered experience. There's a lot of different references there, which I won't really go into, but the seminal work, of course, comes from Hochschild in her identification of the large degree of emotional labour that women perform in a lot of services and a lot of jobs, more so than men, and which for a long time has not been really properly accounted for. But a particular aspect of emotional labour that's less well examined is what we call interpersonal emotional labour. And this is a bit different from standard studies of emotional labour because it's rather than an attempt to bring one's own emotions in line with the social world in which we're moving and in line with the workplace norms, we instead try to engage in emotional labour to affect someone else's emotions and bring them in line with the workplace norms of a particular place. There's only been a few studies that have really looked at this idea of interpersonal emotional labour, gender, and I guess class as well. in a sociological sense. Some distinctive ones have been the work done by Catherine Lively, who did some very interesting work on noting back in 2000 how female paralegals in the US did a lot of upward emotional labor management of their male attorney bosses. In other words, they would be paid in effect to sort of manage the emotions of the people around them. Excuse me. And this raises for me some very interesting ideas about who we do emotional management on behalf of, who are we doing this emotional labor for, who we pay to do this emotional labor for, who's receiving the benefits of interpersonal emotional labor. So in a chapter that I did in an edited collection that I did back in 2021 with Jordan McKenzie at UOW, you can see the title there, Dystopian Emotions. I encourage you all to go and have a look at this very interesting collection. But in a particular chapter I did in this book, I advanced the idea of emotional structuration. This was working off some of the ideas from Anthony Giddens about the structuring of, about structuration and the structuring of structures in society, and also uses or borrows from Bourdieu's work on the various forms of different capital. And from this, I developed the idea of, at least theoretically, of different kinds of emotional roles, emotional labor roles in our society. These are, as I call them, the emotional elites, meaning those who gain the benefits from others' emotional work. An emotional precariat, those who are obliged to perform emotion work in the service economy. And emotional intermediaries, those who mediate between these two groups and manage both upwards and downwards. So, for example, you might think of people who work in call centers as the emotional precariat, who need to be pleasant in dealing with other people on a daily basis, clients and so on. You might think of the emotional elites as the bosses who can run companies and organizations. And you might think of emotional intermediaries as the people who have to manage the emotional precariat at the bottom, but also manage their bosses' difficult emotions at the top. And I was interested in the idea of, are we seeing a rise of emotional elitism in the workforce? So I was also interested in how gendered this is, because gender is essential to the emotional labor question. And I came up with these sort of possible ideas based on looking at some of the literature. Firstly, men are potentially more likely to be emotional elites. Men, for example, are more likely to work in management jobs. Women are more likely to perform interpersonal emotional labor for men in domestic and workspaces, often in support of traditional capitalistic structures. That's from the work of Alva Gottby. And according to some of Marcy Cottingham's work as well, men are more likely to receive emotional labor from women as part of having what she calls a status shield, which is that they are protected from having to deal with some difficult emotional situations by warrant of being in a high status position. Meanwhile, women are more likely to be emotional precariat because they're more likely to work in service jobs. And there's a pervading sense of ongoing sense of gender essentialism in our society, which leads women to be more likely to be recruited into care-based work because they are, through processes of gender essentialism, seen as being naturally more caring, therefore better suited to a care-based workforce. And sometimes this even works along or intersects with racial lines. And I'd point out the work of Jan Patios there on Filipino women working in call centers. And women are also, I would suggest, more likely to be emotional intermediaries. I cite the work from Lively about professionals working with male bosses, and then potentially also women working in industries where they have to combine a lot of professional work with care work, such as in educational systems, nursing, teaching, and so on. And potentially also more likely to manage outsourced emotions, as talked about in Hochschild's more recent work. However, on the other hand, more women are moving into management positions than in the past, and men more men are starting to learn new skills and gain new emotional capital for the service economy. Again, I refer to Marcy Cottingham's work here, where she talks about men moving into roles such as teaching, where they're having to learn new sets of soft skills. So this leads to these research questions. Do men perform more emotional labor than, do women perform more emotional labor than men in the workforce? Which people at work are most likely to be recipients of emotional labor? And men and women more likely to be recipients of emotional labor? In other words, is there a difference between doing emotional labor for others and receiving emotional labor from others? So I placed questions in the 2022-23 Australian Social Attitudes Survey. In particular, this question, designed to elicit information about interpersonal emotional labor. So the question asks people, well, first of all, describes to people about the need to manage the emotions of other people around us at work, and comes up with some examples, and then goes on to ask people if they can please tell us if they need to manage other people's emotions at work or in the community regularly, and if so, what type of person do they most have to emotionally manage? And then they are given these options. So from these options, once you aggregate the results, you're able to put together indicators of who does emotional labor, because there's also the option of saying they don't manage anyone's emotions at work. So we can see who does emotional labor, and we can see who they do the emotional labor for. So I have gathered descriptive statistics on this, as well as some regression models, and I'll show the results of these now today. And in the models, I was able to control for things such as the occupation of the respondent, whether they were a manager, professional, community or personal service worker, or an other worker. I particularly separated community and personal services workers because they're typically the workers who would do a lot of emotional labor at work. And I was also able to work out whether the workforce they were in was male-dominated, female-dominated, or mixed gender, because of the impact that might have on the culture of showing emotions and doing emotional labor in the workforce. So here is the beginning of the results. In the first instance, what we find is that emotional labor was more common in industries where the respondents were managers, professionals, or community or personal service workers, and less common in where there were other workers, which typically means manual and trades workers, which is probably unsurprising. But what we also find is that in keeping very well with the Hochschild and so on literature about emotional labor, women do more of it than men. Women are more likely to do interpersonal emotional labor in all occupations, with exception possibly of the community and personal service workers. The regression results here effectively confirm what I just showed you in terms of descriptive statistics. These are a series of logistic regressions where a number under the exponent under less than 1 means you are less likely to perform emotional labor based on the characteristic over here. I've highlighted those in yellow, and a number above 1 means you're more likely, and I've highlighted those in green. So being male was significantly made you significantly less likely to perform any emotional labor. So that's, after all controls are put in, that still holds up. So there's definitely a gender angle about performing emotional labor for others. Then being an other worker made you less likely to perform emotional labor as well. And being in a male-dominated workforce down the bottom here made you less likely to perform emotional labor as well. These are all pretty straightforward and to be expected results. Next, I looked at interpersonal emotional labor when we're and who it is delivered for, who are the recipients of the emotional labor. And it turned out that colleagues are the most common category reported for who we do the emotional labor for, while bosses were the least likely category for who we do the emotional labor for. Though women were more likely to do emotional labour for bosses and for clients than were men, so with a significant difference. The regression results also confirm this. The men were less likely to do emotional labour for bosses, although men of a particular kind, this column here is whether regression is run just on men alone. Within men, men who were had grown-up children, so older men, older fathers, and men experiencing financial hardship were more likely to perform emotional labour for colleagues. Men were less likely to perform emotional labour for clients, as opposed to women, who were more likely to perform emotional labour for clients. But men were more likely to perform emotional labour for staff. And that's particularly when they were managers. So they were down performing emotional labour for staff who might work for them. Okay. And then,
Roger, 1 minute left.
Okay. And then finally, in terms of the gender that the emotional labour is performed for, and this is what's interesting, the emotional labour is much more likely to be performed for women than for men. So while women are doing more emotional labour, they are also receiving more emotional labour, and that's roughly what this chart here shows as well. So I'll just skip to the conclusion. Women do perform more emotional labour, particularly in male-dominated fields, which supports the idea that women are somewhat of an emotional precariat intermediate class. They're somewhat more likely to perform emotional labour upwards and sideways towards bosses and clients. However, bosses actually receive very little emotional labour compared to other groups, and for men, some men who have certain characteristics will perform more or less than others. But men attract less emotional labour compared to women. Men give and receive less emotional labour. So overall, my conclusion is women are more likely to be emotional precariat and intermediaries, but also emotional elites in receiving more emotional labour, and men are less likely to be any of these things. Okay, thanks very much for your time.
Thanks, Roger. That was excellent. And I know that there's a series of publications as well that we can follow up for other details. So I'll encourage anyone that's got questions to hold them till the end while I introduce Dr. Belinda Lunnay. Dr. Belinda Lunnay is a research fellow and public health sociologist within the Research Centre for Public Health, Equity and Human Flourishing at Torrens University. Her focus is on the social systems and structures that prevent illness and protect health, with a particular interest in inequity on the basis of social class and gender. Her research generates translational outcomes for real-world improvements, utilising principles of health promotion and community engagement. So she'll be presenting on some data around women in midlife in different social classes and their engagements with alcohol. So over to you, Belle.
Thank you for that introduction, Kristen, and also for the invitation to speak. Let me get myself sorted out. Okay, wonderful. So, yeah, thank you for inviting me again to speak, Kristen. And what I'm going to present on today is a book chapter that we actually co-authored, Kristen and I, with some colleagues of ours, Professor Megan Warren and Professor Paul Ward. So this is shared IP. And the work that we've done is really about women's effective experiences of happiness, or as it turns out, of unhappiness as well, based on some interviews that we did during COVID-19 lockdowns in South Australia, which we did to understand the role of consuming alcohol as a way of coping or managing uncertainty during lockdowns, or perhaps thriving and flourishing during lockdowns. And I'm presenting it today. Kristen thought it might be a neat sort of case study, if you will, of the ways that social class interacts with our emotions along kind of moralistic type lines. And hopefully it's a neat segue into Stephen's talk. So I would just like to also briefly echo my acknowledgements that I'm coming to you from the lands of the Kaurna people, and that these lands were never ceded. So look, I am sorry to traumatise everyone with memories of COVID-19 lockdowns, particularly if you're joining from Melbourne. Just to state, I realised that in South Australia, we were almost preoccupied by perfecting the sourdough loaf, while people in Melbourne were experiencing quite a long, elongated lockdown experience. And for some, this meant prolonged periods of homeschooling children. Other people lost jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a period of time that certainly mobilised people's emotions. And I think for happiness scholars, it was a time of deep intrigue. It was dubbed by Time magazine as the biggest threat to collective happiness that we've ever experienced. And alongside this, I think reflective of our neoliberal politics, there was this idea that maintaining happiness despite this uncertainty and precarity was a national priority. It was a personal enterprise. The World Health Organization, released toolkits on how we can govern our own happiness. The responsible citizen was one that maintained happiness and carried on, and this almost denoted personal success. And so I'll foreground and say this is a really hard ask for people who are living with hardship and who had less agency to navigate oppressive structural forces that sort of challenge happiness. And now you might recall during COVID, with all the paraphernalia coming out, stay home, keep well, etc., there was a "we're all in this together" slogan that came out. And Ben Lee hasn't recovered from the use of his song, I'm sure, being used as this sort of chime that we were all supposed to be singing to. And at the time that this was being shown, I wondered how this was going to be received by women in our research who were living in poverty and living precarious lives prior to the pandemic, noting Diane Ray's realisation that poverty is not an environment in which emotional capital normally thrives. So are we really all in this together? And certainly, as we've just heard Roger pointing out, for women in particular, there's an absorption of some emotional labours that really was writ large during COVID-19, where care burdens, domestic responsibilities were carried by women. So with that kind of backdrop, that kind of context, we looked at our data again to sort of understand what are the implications for women's happiness. And so just to give an idea of some theory that was the platform and the lens through which we looked at for interpreting our data. At the time, I became a bit obsessed with Carl Cederstrom's happiness fantasy, and which explains the title of the talk. And this was to recognise that a sociology of happiness sees this emotion, happiness, just like it does with all emotions, as a collective experience, or as Durkheim, I think, coined, a collective effervescence. And so there's this affective dimension to our everyday experiences, but also that collective experience is relational. So we look to others so that we can configure our own responses. And because it's relational, it's moralistic. And so there's a certain element of judgment around our emotions. And this is important context to this idea of the happiness fantasy, because our emotions are situated within social norms, desirable identities, and they sort of reinforce the privilege of the affluent classes. And so we were wondering, is happiness a fantasy only for the privileged? So I think one of the things that it's important to point out as well is that part of this moralistic dimension of our emotions is that it reinstates a social order. And so that there becomes, if we think about Bourdieu's work, there becomes these sort of struggles for recognition of what is a good life and who has access to it, who gets to decide. And then there are these sort of morally reprehensible outcomes when we don't kind of fall into that order. So when we engage with social class and experiences of happiness, we kind of engage with these moral undertones. And Sarah Ahmed reminds us that happiness is located in privilege. And so there's a certain level of validity, and we sort of seek legitimization of our emotional reactions to things. And I think we did see that during COVID-19 in relation to happiness. So just to also clarify that when we're thinking about happiness, we're not talking about these fleeting moments of feeling and being happy, but rather these more deep-seated, eudaimonia kind of experience, these feelings of being able to flourish in life and live a good and happy life. So I'm going to just now take you into our study and think about how power struggles play out across classes and how this might look for different women. A bit of a show and tell about their alcohol consumption, their reasons for drinking, and then happiness through that alcohol as a happiness object. So we did some interviews with women before the pandemic. We recontacted them and we had done 50, and then we recontacted them and 40 said yes, they'd like to speak with us all over again to understand their reasons and logics for consuming alcohol once the pandemic was part of their lives. Noting that prior alcohol was had differentiated our sample of women on the basis of social class, where women who were drinking alcohol to celebrate and to represent their success were situated in more affluent positions, as is not surprising, I guess, and women who were living with less privileges, the classes sort of, and their access to resources reduced, were drinking alcohol to manage their feelings of sometimes shame, and then their feelings of living perhaps a mediocre type life. So we interviewed women. We then looked at our data through this deductive lens, where we were looking at practice theory and we're trying to see social class in the data, running queries against some themes around what women said about the reasons for consuming alcohol relative to their social class position. So basically this idea of what is happiness and what does happiness allow. And I hope you won't mind, I will use here some nicknames that Saul Alinsky came up with from to sort of characterize the predominant three social class groups, where he talked about affluent classes as the haves and the middle classes as the have not, have a little about want mores, and the working class group as have-nots. And I think I like it because it characterizes this notion of the structures of power that maintain our social class positions, and they reduce our social mobility, and that affects our emotions. I should also just go back and just say we actually did measure social class, and maybe we can talk about it if anyone's got any questions, but we utilised the Great British Household Survey, Great British Class Survey that Michael Savage established and rolled out based on Bourdieu's relational social class theory, and that was then utilised by some researchers and academics at ANU, Jill Shepherd and Nicholas Biddle, so it's tested in Australia. So I want to start with the haves first. So all the women that we interviewed drank alcohol, and 4 women who were in this group called the haves, the affluent women, they seemed to generally consume alcohol to celebrate happiness, and they were actually able to reduce their drinking, and that seemed to be like a demonstration of their agency. So most certainly these women were capable of cultivating a sense of satisfaction in being able to live a good life despite this worldwide crisis. Their narratives were kind of an echo chamber for that individualistic mindset of the happiness project in that government paraphernalia that I pointed out at the start. So, you can see in some of these quotes, I'm not going to read them out in the interest of time, but just some of the highlight words that, there's this tendency that we've got to really look after ourselves. You've got to have a positive mindset. We should be thankful for what we've got. And there's this notion of enjoyment, feeling robust, and as I said, therefore being able to make reductions in alcohol and really engage these other ways that women can tap into happiness and live a good and fulfilling life without alcohol when you're living in a context that is flush with resources, as the affluent class women were and are. So moving then to middle class women, we can see a slight shift. So this group is sort of, as the nickname points out, is the group that kind of straddle the middle ground between adversity and affluence. So they kind of used alcohol to keep on track, we found. So unlike working class women, which I'll walk through shortly, they were not necessarily drinking with completely negative undertones, but there were some positives, but they had to keep a lid on this. You know, they still had kind of a sense of needing to put boundaries around their alcohol consumption, and they spoke about this in ways that showed there's a moral compass to good behavior. You know, we've got to be drinking in Australia. Everyone wants, you know, mostly we kind of herald the drinker in Australia, but we herald the drinker who drinks in the right ways and for the right reasons. So there's almost this kind of moral failing if we're drinking too much and drinking, you know, in ways that don't match the civilities that we expect around alcohol consumption. So we can see women here are talking about having their normal perks. So there's also that idealization of the middle class practices when it comes to alcohol consumption. And also that this is not necessarily flippant, but there's almost an ambivalence around drinking. We're all drinking, that's just what everyone does. And that's okay, that's all fair. So with the have-nots moving down to get this real sense of the class distinctions, this group of women, some were living in poverty, if not on very low incomes, and they talked about consuming alcohol in ways that we interpreted as to manage their unhappiness, to kind of cope with their worries. There was a sense of censure in their descriptions. They might not come across as a quote on the quotes on the screen, but certainly women talked about feeling like there was a culture of blame around their lives, and that when they need alcohol to be able to cope with those lives, and to manufacture this idea of happiness, really use alcohol as the object that they can cling on to and get a grip on some sense of being able to emulate what the good life looks like and or live it, that they were then held kind of, you know, there was a moral reprehension for that. So unlike the women that we've just walked through who are in privileged positions, these women were kind of finding life tough and using alcohol as a way to tune out a little bit, a nice sort of way to float away for a moment in time. And they had limited other resources on which to draw their happiness from. So I'm hoping that that has given a bit of an idea of how social class and emotions are linked via alcohol as the happiness object, and some of the associated moralities. And so just to summarize, if, as Giddens says, that happiness inoculates against precarity, my concern is who is missing out on that. So particularly in light of our findings I've run through, that women's experiences of happiness and or unhappiness, and alcohol as the happiness object during lockdowns, really did expose some of these issues around human potential, around differentiated possibilities, and certainly some of the power structures and mechanisms of distinction that operate. And I mean, I haven't even touched on the gendered ways that we can't talk about women and not talk about gender, obviously, but that's another talk, I think. But certainly in terms of the social class issues around how we manufacture happiness, some people manufacture happiness through alcohol consumption, is concerning given the relative harms of alcohol for health. And as I said, I'm situated in public health, and so I think we need to be really paying attention to who gets left behind with this. All right, that's enough from me, I think.
Thanks, Belinda. That was really excellent. And similar to Roger, there's lots of publicly available articles that kind of map out more dimensions of that work, and particularly the model of social class that was used to guide the thinking around how to divide social class, which, goodness, well done keeping to time, Belinda. And I think Stephen will kind of build on this and maybe challenge us to think a bit differently about social class and how it might be measured. I suppose we'll find out. So I'll just read out Stephen's bio. Associate Professor Stephen Threadgold is Director of the Newcastle Youth Studies Centre at University of Newcastle. His research monograph, Youth Class and Everyday Struggles, draws on ideas of effective economies, reflexivity, and the work of Pierre Bourdieu. It also won TASA's 2020 Raewyn Connell's Prize for Best First Book. Well done, Stephen. His approach to youth sociology recognises that young people's lives can be shaped by economic forces and by class symbolic and moral boundaries. So lots of cross-cutting threads here, which I'll leave Stephen to pull us through. Thanks.
Thanks, Kristen. Everyone can hear me, I assume. So yeah, thanks for putting this on. Thanks for TASA for running these events. They're always really good, and I think we sometimes take TASA for granted, and it's such a great association. It's been a really great thing for me to be involved in over the years. So I want to talk a little bit about, I suppose, the way that emotions and affect, I suppose, relate to processes of digitalization and financialization. So this isn't one of those talks that says we have to rethink everything. You know, I think the people that claim those things sometimes it's kind of, those talks tend to be bullshit, I think. But there's a lot of new things, I think, that's happening at the moment that we need to think about in terms of how inequality works, that are kind of, I would describe as like a new layer on top of all the traditional inequalities that we're all very much understanding, I think, and as the previous two talks have shown. So my work has been very much about, I think, essentially symbolic violence has been the thing that I've been most interested in all the research that I've been doing over the years around, you know, youth transitions, labour markets, education, creativity, and things like that. And certainly the emotionality of class, the way that class is kind of made in everyday moments, has been a key thing that I've been interested in. But I think the way that inequality is, shall we say, being automated is a kind of thing that we need to think about as sociologists, in the sense that it kind of challenges some of the conceptual things that we take for granted. And we maybe need to adjust the way that we think about these things a little bit. And it certainly has implications, I think, for the sociology of emotions and effects, because I think the dehumanization of the way that inequality is disseminated is also interesting to think about from those points of view. So the work we've been doing in the Newcastle Youth Study Centre with my colleagues, particularly Julia Cook and Julia Coffey and David Ferrugia, who's moved on now, and a couple of other people. We've been looking at stuff around the financialization of everyday life, and particularly the way young people use apps and buy now, pay later and various fintech to make their lives. And what we can see here is a kind of moralization and a very emotional moralization of what it means to be in debt and how they think about people in debt, how they think about themselves. So the photo there is from a workshop, a body mapping workshop, where young people we were talking to basically invented this character, Zoe, to talk about debt. She was a victim. She buys too much stuff. She was instant gratification. She's, you know, even thinking about all this kind of getting into debt was like, for the young people, we're like killing them. You know, it's like stressful, stop it. What's really interesting here, I think, in terms of the emotionality of everyday life, is the young people who were in this workshop were all in debt themselves. But they were then kind of making these very moral, panicky, almost stories about other young people that they imagined were in different kinds of debt. But really, they were very much similar, right? They were very, the character was very much in the same kind of debt that they were in, but like they were kind of then relaying these kind of very much moralistic ideas onto Zoe. She has lines on her face because she's stressed, and she's like interested in like consumer desires, and she makes bad decisions. The young people in this workshop were very much replicating the moral panics about young people, about them being irresponsible and all this kind of stuff, despite the fact that, you know, it's almost impossible for anyone not to be in debt and not to be using these things in one way or another. So in terms of the class positionality of these kind of things. And I'm talking here quite generally about across a bunch of different projects, and starting to kind of think about this conceptually. There's been a lot of really, I think, excellent work in youth studies about how young people are kind of impelled to be an entrepreneurial subject. They need to make the right choices. They need to invest in themselves and all that kind of thing. They need to increasingly, some of the research around this is around about how people are speculative. They need to invest in their future. In our projects, particularly young people that aren't privileged, I think what we're seeing is there's a kind of distinction in that kind of entrepreneurial or speculative orientation towards the future, where the more privileged can do that. They can envision themselves as investing in their lives and taking on, for instance, good debt like HECS and things like that. That's an investment in the self. Others seem to be like more like kind of gambling around the future, particularly because many of the things that young people are told from an early age, that like there's a meritocracy, and that if you make the right choices, everything will work out, that those kind of things. They're increasingly seeing, I think, into their early 20s that all that kind of stuff is not actually true, and they're feeling a little bit ripped off and sold out. So in our research, there's this kind of like sense of ambivalence, like a whatever, or kind of, kind of a fuck it attitude towards the future. I'll just kind of do this stuff now. We'll see how it works out. But like, I know that investing in, like, if it's going to pay off, it's like very dubious whether that's a thing. So there's kind of this distinction, I think, in dispositions in terms of orienting towards the future. What's interesting in this, and I suppose everyone in the room here at the moment is in higher education, is particularly the attitudes towards things like higher education. And I think this is a relatively new thing, and this, I think, also relates to the changes in funding and the way that the work-ready graduates, or whatever it was called, massively means that many more students are in huge debt. We see them kind of now talking about how, like, they're not sure that this kind of good debt, that in some of our research people talk about how HECS is a good debt, it's an investment in the future. Others are now talking about how it's not necessarily going to pay off, or they can't see how it works out. I haven't seen many dividends for it. Very much they're in kind of gambling investment language there. HECS is meant to be an investment, but it depends. Study is about getting into debt. And this, for all our respondents, being in debt had a real imposition on the way that they thought about the future. So financialization of everyday life is one thing, but what we're also interested in here, particularly when using these kind of buy now, pay later and fintech apps, is the way that data is being increasingly used to automate inequality. So work that I'm doing at the moment, I'm working with Roger Burrows and Beverly Skeggs on a paper at the moment about whether Bourdieu now works for the bank. And what we mean by this is that in the realm of big data, everything that we do online, every kind of mouse click, everything we look at, everything we consume, is creating profiles. And I'll just show you those quickly there. I'll come back to that. That are being bought and sold by various institutions, and these are kind of categorizing us in ways that we actually don't know about until often it's too late. Increasingly about rental properties, mortgage, insurance, all these kind of things all these kind of data points are being used for this kind of stuff. Even our music tastes. So your Spotify playlists and what you listen to on there is being enrolled into these profiles. So in terms, again, of things like symbolic violence, cultural capital, the very famous Bourdieu taste classifiers and the classifiers, the classifier, the way that this kind of things is happening in the background now, and automated through, large language models and AI and all that kind of stuff, I think challenges some of the ways that we understand this. I mean, if someone says to you in day-to-day life that they hate the band that you like, or you feel out of place in a museum, all those kind of classic Borgesian symbolic violence things as a way of thinking about how class is made in everyday life. The way that these kind of automated things are happening in the background are taking those experiences, our tastes, our genres, our consumption, and kind of overlaying that in the background in terms of categories in ways that we don't really have any access to or understand, and are often quite inaccurate, but are very much used to, as many now studies are showing, particularly in the US, about like replicating things like gender, race, and class inequalities. Particularly the case with in the UK with mortgages and insurance and rental properties. These things are increasingly being automated. You put in a thing now to get a rental property. They evaluate your application based on all the data they have. And the data they have isn't necessarily about you as an individual. You'll be in some kind of category. And this is a kind of Experian category here, one of the companies that makes these things, where you're put into these kind of very Borgesian groups. You see the one I've circled up there, Gen X couples without children renting apartments in terraces with high growth suburbs. I mean, it's kind of eerie when these things seem to identify you. That very much seems something like me, but then I'm like, oh, hang on a minute, I'm actually renting, I have a mortgage. So the categories work in some ways, but they're also like not that accurate as well. Nevertheless, these are the things that companies are increasingly using through automation to decide, you know, what kind of coverage you get, what kind of, whether you get a rental and all that kind of thing. So to kind of sum up, I think in terms of the ways that the sociology of emotions, and particularly when we consider class, has, you know, a long-standing history, I think, of really excellent ways to consider how, you know, class is made in everyday life. But as those kind of considerations become increasingly automated, happening in the background, happening in ways that we don't really get to experience other until the category is made for us and it's too late, I think we need to maybe think a little bit about how we need to consider that from a sociological perspective. Our cultural consumption is increasingly panopticonic. It's kind of obvious. Things like genres and taste and stuff now classify us, but like they don't really classify the classifier, because the classifier is increasingly a machine. And so this has kind of ramifications for how we need to understand emotions, effects in everyday life in terms of class inequalities and in terms of all kinds of inequalities, I think. The other thing I would like just briefly point out there too here is, like, in terms of that, all that big data stuff, this is increasingly being combined with genetic stuff around, you know, people's ancestry.com and that kind of thing. The level of data that companies have on us is quite actually daunting when you start to understand it. And it's increasingly, I think, an issue when, you know, companies start to think like genetically whether, you know, you're predisposed to like dancing or not, which seems quite absurd. But like literally, if you go through the ancestry.com kind of stuff and put your genes in and get all this kind of stuff back, this is kind of the data they increasingly have. All the data from our ancestry, from our everyday consumption is being used to classify us in ways that I think as sociologists we increasingly need to engage with from a critical level to understand how that works and how that's having effects on everyday life. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephen. That was really thought-provoking. I don't know if anyone was racing to see themselves on the graph of what kind of category you fit into. So I'll have a look at that later, and I'm sure the slides will be disseminated afterwards as well. So I wanted to open up to anyone watching that wanted to ask a question of one of the presenters or about some of the interplays they saw between them. to try and engage their big brains on those issues. We've got 9 minutes, so I reckon that's probably 2 to 3 questions, and then anything else can be handled out of session. Did anyone want to pop their hand up?
Hello.
Hello.
Oh, I do not find any hand raise option here. I am calling from Bangladesh. So can I ask a question?
Of course, lovely to have you.
Okay. So I am Sheikh Mohammed Kayes. I am a new member of TASA. I am from Bangladesh. So my question is to Roger Vincent for the first presenter, So your presentation, all these 3 presentations are very fascinating presentations. I like them very much. I have a specific question to Roger Vincent. Roger, do you think that there is a connection between your findings on the gender dimension of IEL and the so-called male brain, female brain dichotomy? In other words, is IEL somehow connected to human biology? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I'll just start by saying that as a good sociologist, which I am, I'm very reluctant to pin gender differences on biology. In fact, that's a topic I talk about in another paper about gender essentialist perspectives versus social constructionist perspectives. So my answer to your question roughly is no. I don't think the differences I'm picking up are anything to do with male-female brains. They are much more to do with the social construction of gender, male and female personalities. And of course, there's not just male and female, there's gender-neutral constructions as well. And also it's to do with the way our workplaces are structured along gendered lines to encourage particular forms of behavior from people working in those workplaces. So those things all interact. So yeah, the answer is no, I don't believe it's about male-female brains. If I have understood your question correctly. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I can just see another question pop up in the chat for Roger, and then we'll go to James, who I can see you've got your hand up. So from Jessie Fletcher, Roger, how does one account or control for or respond to gendered understandings of what IEL or EL is when conducting interviews? Are you able to canvass a response to that?
Yeah, interesting question. So my data here was quantitative, where they had to fill out their own answer to a survey question. So they would choose for themselves the most appropriate category. I know that the responses are fairly sensible. In other words, people did understand the question they were asked, because very few said don't know, or I can't answer in response. They knew how to answer that question for the most part. But your question is more specific about interviews, so qualitative interviewing approaches, as I assume what you're talking about, and how does one account and control for gendered understandings? Yeah, well, I mean, it all depends on what your research question is that you want to find out about, I guess. If you're following my research question, you wanted to ask them about their emotional labor they do for others. You might ask them to define for themselves how they interact with others in an emotional way, and how they help themselves, how they help each other out. And then beyond that, if you wanted to ask them about specific takes on gender and labor, you could sort of push that in there. Sorry, I'm not sure I can give a really satisfactory answer to this question, because I need to know exactly what it is you're after in asking this question. I hope that's, sorry, it doesn't feel like a very satisfactory answer. Thanks. Yeah.
All good. Jessie clarified that her audio isn't working, but she's going to follow up with you. So James, can I pass over to you?
Thanks, Kristen, and thanks everyone for your talks. Also interesting in different ways. Roger, my question's for you, but I'm kind of bringing in some ideas from Belinda and Stephen as well, because I think they touch on some really important kind of affective kind of atmospheres for young people at the moment. There's like obligation to be happy and this entrepreneurial attitude, and those ideas kind of made me rethink the data that you had, and maybe you've thought about this and could expand on it a bit more, because I've had a lot of experiences where there's a lot of emotional labor going on to try and convince or compel or encourage me to be more enthusiastic at work. And so obviously, you know, the manager or the colleague or whatever is doing that labor as a management style. But actually it takes a lot of labor for me to receive that labor, as in trying to negotiate your manager's desire for you to be more like go get 'em, take more initiative, be more of a, you know, special, you know, neoliberal subject, right? So I guess how are you thinking about this like ecosystem of emotional labor that's not only being like the manager managing you, but you having to kind of deal with that in the workplace?
Yeah, it's such an interesting space, isn't it? To have to to manage that. By warrant of an answer, just a small anecdote is I remember working at another university which I won't name, for an organization which I won't name, and in came boss male academic who I won't name, flanked by 5 female subordinate workers to tell everybody that they had to do cost efficiencies and they were going to be sacking some people. And then he finished off that statement by saying, "See ya, I'm off to Europe." And he walked out the door and left the 5 female people there to handle the crowd. And this really stands out in my head as the a strong example of these emotional intermediaries, the people who the boss can dump in the situation of having to deal with other people's emotions and then leave, so that they effectively deal with emotions both ways. And it's hard work, yeah. And so, you know, your example of needing to deal with your boss's requirements, that you have a certain emotional presence that fits the norms of the company, is work that you have to do, as well as then going and dealing with the clients, and so you're sort of facing things both ways. So yeah, the idea of the intermediary is very, very interesting for me, because I think we can all picture the top level and the bottom level, but this sort of intermediary role and it's the way it works backwards and forwards is interesting. I did notice in Belinda's presentation that she talked about the different classes of people, and she had a three group system as well, of the, you know, and I was kind of interested in her intermediate class as well, the ones that are have some degree of control, some degree of power about, for example, you know, whether they're going to drink or not, and its meaning. They're not compelled to do it the way perhaps the ones at the bottom are, but nonetheless, they're not free to take the positive, truly positive stance they'd like to take in sort of managing their alcohol consumption. You know, I at least that's how I picked it up. So please correct me if I'm wrong, Belinda. Sorry. Yeah, but I hope that sort of addresses some of your questions. Again, I'm rambling a lot. Really sorry about that.
Well, good. Well, I think we've reached 1 o'clock, but I think the complexity that we've kind of reached in terms of the different layers and working between the public and the private, and the interplay, and then the introduction of, you know, data to constitute ideal subjectivities that are then kind of externalized and have real consequences for the dehumanization of inequality. I think that might be why we're all getting a bit tangled up, because they're really, they're complex. So I just wanted to say thank you again to all the presenters for your brilliant scholarship, and for presenting us with ideas today that I'm sure we'll continue to think with and think from. So I wish everyone a happy Thursday, and catch you at the next month. All right, thanks so much.